My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 70 years old. I have raised a child, buried a husband, and built a life from the bedrock of my own resilience. I have learned that strength isn't about the burdens you can carry, but about the moment you decide which ones to finally set down. To most of the world, I am a retired librarian, a quiet woman with a fondness for Agatha Christie and well-tended rose bushes. But to my daughter, Sarah, on my 70th birthday, I was apparently worth a box of store-bought cookies. The cheap kind, with the waxy chocolate and the dough that tastes of chemical vanilla and vague regret. They arrived in a dented cardboard box, delivered by a courier who seemed more concerned with getting a signature than with the milestone the package represented. There was no card, just the flimsy plastic tray of identical, factory-pressed circles. I stared at them, and a silence that had been gathering in my heart for decades finally became deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a space that should have been filled with love, but was instead a vacuum of obligation. My mind, a librarian's mind, is a catalogue of memories, each one filed away with meticulous detail. As I looked at the pathetic cookies, the card catalogue of my memory spun open to a specific drawer. Sarah, birthdays. Age 8. I saw my own hands, 30 years younger, dusted with flour, working late into the night. My husband, Robert, had already gone to bed, the scent of his pipe tobacco lingering in the living room. But I was awake, constructing a princess castle cake. It was a marvel of architectural confectionery, with turrets made of ice cream cones dipped in pink-tinted white chocolate, and a drawbridge of licorice whips. It took me 6 hours. I remember the look on Sarah's face the next morning, her eyes wide with a pure, uncomplicated joy that a parent would move mountains to see. That was the kind of mother I was. The kind who built castles out of cake. The kind who sewed Halloween costumes by hand, who edited college essays at 2 a.m, who co-signed for a first car with shaking hands and a hopeful heart. I was the provider, the bedrock, the quiet engine that powered her world. And in return, after 70 years on this earth, I received a box of supermarket cookies. A bitter, ironic laugh escaped my lips, dry and unused. The absurdity was almost poetic. I knew for a fact that just last month, Sarah had sent her mother-in-law, Margaret, a gourmet food basket from a ridiculously expensive delicatessen downtown. It was for a Tuesday. No birthday, no anniversary. Just because. It had contained artisanal cheeses, a bottle of French wine that cost more than my weekly groceries, and handcrafted olive oils. I knew because Sarah had called me to describe it in detail, her voice glowing with self-satisfaction. Margaret was just so thrilled, Mom, she'd said. She said it was the most thoughtful thing. It's so important to me that she knows how much she's appreciated. The words hung in the air between us then, unspoken and heavy. And what about me, Sarah? What about the woman who gave you life, who built you castles, who funded your dreams? When does she get to feel appreciated? I had swallowed the question then, just as I had swallowed 1,000 other hurts. But now, staring at this box of cheap cookies, I found I was full. There was no more room for swallowed pain. The cookies were not a gift. They were a statement. They were a symbol of my place in her life, an afterthought, a checkbox on a to-do list, filed somewhere between pick-up dry cleaning and schedule pest control. They were the culmination of 1,000 tiny cuts that had finally bled me dry. I picked up the box. The plastic crinkled under my fingers. And in that quiet, sun-drenched living room, with the ghosts of 70 years looking on, the hurt that had been my constant companion began to curdle, transforming into something colder, harder, and infinitely more useful. It was resolve. The box of cookies sat on my polished oak coffee table like an exhibit in a trial. Exhibit A, The People vs. Eleanor Vance's Lifetime of Devotion. It was a flimsy piece of evidence, but it represented the weight of 1,000 heavier, invisible truths. To an outsider, my reaction might seem extreme. A silly old woman making a fuss over a trifle. But it was never about the cookies. It was about the slow, systemic erosion of my value in my own daughter's eyes. As I sat there, the memories continued to surface, not with the soft focus of nostalgia, but with the sharp, incriminating clarity of a prosecutor's file. I opened the mental drawer labeled Sarah, wedding, age 28. The figure that flashed in my mind was as clear as if it were on a bank statement, $50,000. It was a significant portion of what Robert and I had saved, the nest egg he had insisted on protecting. "For you, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice raspy in those final months. "For your peace of mind," but Sarah had cried. She had sat at this very coffee table, her tears splashing onto a glossy bridal magazine, lamenting how she and Mark couldn't possibly afford the dream wedding at the country club. My peace of mind versus her dream wedding. It was a battle I was destined to lose. I wrote the check. I remember the tight feeling in my chest as I did it, a premonition of what this transaction truly meant. My thanks. A passing mention in the father of the bride's speech and a complaint, whispered to a bridesmaid, but loud enough for me to hear, that the champagne I'd paid for wasn't Veuve Clicquot. It was just a generic, if expensive, brut. A lesser vintage. Just like me. Then came the drawer labeled favoritism, Exhibit B, Margaret. I recalled a Christmas from 2 years ago. I had spent weeks knitting a beautiful, intricate Aran sweater for Sarah, using the finest merino wool. It was a labor of love, my arthritis flaring up as I worked the complex cable patterns. She opened it, smiled a polite, thin smile, and said, "Oh, wow, Mom. That's very crafty." She folded it and put it aside. Later that day, she presented her mother-in-law, Margaret, with a first edition copy of To the Lighthouse, signed by Virginia Woolf. It had cost her nearly $3,000. She had crowed about the online auction she'd won, the thrill of the chase. She presented it to Margaret, with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Margaret, a retired English teacher, was moved to tears. And I watched, my hands aching from the useless, crafty sweater I had made, and understood. Sarah didn't value sacrifice, she valued performance. My love was quiet, dependable, and unconditional, like tap water. Margaret's approval was a commodity to be purchased, an achievement to be displayed. I was infrastructure, Margaret was art. The final, damning memory was the most recent. The phone call. I had been feeling lonely, the anniversary of Robert's passing weighing on me. I called Sarah, just to hear her voice. "Mom, I can't talk right now," she'd said, her voice rushed and annoyed. "I'm on my way to take Margaret to her spa appointment. It's her monthly self-care day. So important my grief, my loneliness, was an inconvenience. Her mother-in-law's pedicure was a sacred duty." The phone clicked, and I was left holding the silence once again. That's when I picked up my own phone and called my friend, Beatrice. BEA, a widow like me but with a spine of pure steel, listened patiently as I recounted the tale of the cookies. I expected sympathy. I got fury. "That's not a gift, Eleanor," she barked down the line, her voice crackling with indignation. "That's a dismissal. It's a pat on the head to the help. You are not the help. You are her mother." Her words were a splash of cold water. She was right. All this time, I had seen myself as the giver, the provider, the martyr. BEA's words reframed it. I wasn't a martyr. I was an accomplice in my own diminishment. By accepting the crumbs she threw me, I was agreeing to their value. I was validating the dynamic. I was telling her, yes, this is all I am worth. Looking at the box, I felt the final flicker of hurt extinguish, replaced by a cold, cleansing anger. This box was not my portion. It was my opportunity. It was a tool. To change a story that was 40 years in the writing, you couldn't just edit a page. You had to burn the book and start a new one. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, what the first chapter of my new book would be. The decision, once made, settled over me with a profound and startling calm. There was no more turmoil, no more hurt. There was only the quiet, efficient hum of purpose. I stood up, my movements deliberate. I went to my bedroom, bypassed the comfortable cardigans I usually wore, and chose a smart tweed blazer that I hadn't worn in years. I put on a string of pearls Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror. I did not see a frail, forgotten old woman. I saw Eleanor Vance, a woman of substance, a woman who was about to reclaim her own narrative. I took my car keys from the hook by the door, the small jingle echoing in the silent house. Then, I picked up the box of cookies. It felt surprisingly light, utterly insignificant. The drive to Margaret's house was not long, perhaps 15 minutes through the leafy suburban streets I knew so well. But in that short time, a lifetime of slights played out in my mind, not as wounds, but as justifications. I remembered the down payment. Another mental file drawer slid open, this one holding a figure that still made my breath catch: $25,000. It was the last of Robert's life insurance, the money earmarked for a new roof, for potential medical bills, for a cruise to Alaska I'd always dreamed of. Sarah and her husband, Mark, had been priced out of the housing market, their despair constant, oppressive cloud in every conversation. "We'll just be renting forever, Mom," Sarah had wailed, as if it were a life sentence in a gulag. So I'd given it to them. Not loaned. Given? I remembered sitting in the sterile office of the bank, signing the cashier's check over to them, feeling a piece of my own security chip away. Their gratitude was fleeting. A quick, "Oh, thanks, Mom, you're a lifesaver," before they immediately began arguing about granite countertops versus quartz. I had paid for their foundation, and they were already fussing about the decor, having forgotten the bedrock on which it all stood. Margaret lived in a lovely, modest brick house with a garden that was almost as meticulous as my own. I had always liked Margaret. She was a kind, intelligent woman who had raised a good son. She was not my enemy. She was, however, the perfect instrument for my message. She answered the door with a warm smile, looking genuinely pleased to see me. "Eleanor. What a wonderful surprise. Please, come in, I can't stay." "Margaret, thank you," I said, my voice smooth and friendly. I held out the box of cookies. "I just wanted to drop these by. They are from Sarah." Margaret's eyebrows rose in surprise. "From Sarah? How lovely." I leaned in, as if sharing a delightful secret. "Yes. It's my birthday today, you know, my 70th, I smiled brightly. "And Sarah sent these over. But she called me just after they arrived, and she was insistent. "Mom," she said, "you have to take these to Margaret. She's the best baker I know, and I would be so honored if she would try them and tell me what she thinks. You know how she is, Margaret. She admires you so." The lie was audacious, a masterpiece of strategic cruelty cloaked in suffocating sweetness. Every word was designed to do two things: to make Margaret feel cherished, and to corner Sarah in a trap of her own making. Margaret beamed, her face suffused with a genuine warmth that twisted the knife in my own heart. This feeling, this simple, unadulterated pleasure of being appreciated, was what I had craved for years. It was so easy to give. "Oh my goodness," Margaret said, taking the box. "How incredibly thoughtful of her. She's such a wonderful daughter. You must be so proud, Eleanor." I met her gaze, my own expression a perfect mask of maternal pride. "I am," I said, and the word tasted like ash. "I truly am." "Well, I'll let you get back to your day. Enjoy the cookies." I turned and walked back to my car, my back straight, my steps even. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the invisible threads of my old life snapping, one by one. The door to Margaret's house closed with a soft click, and it sounded like the locking of a cage I had just stepped out of. The act was done. The message was sent. Not by text, not by email, but by a box of cheap, store-bought cookies, now delivered to their precise, intended target. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of suspended animation. It wasn't dread, it was anticipation. I knew the storm would break. A reckoning was coming. For the first time in a very long time, I felt ready for it. I didn't pace or wring my hands. I went out into my garden. I deadheaded the roses, my fingers moving deftly among the thorns, pulling away the withered, brown blooms to make way for new growth. The metaphor was not lost on me. I weeded the patch of earth where my tomatoes were growing, my hands sinking into the rich, dark soil. I was tending to my own world, a world I had neglected while I was so busy tending to hers. I made myself a simple dinner, a fresh tomato salad and a piece of grilled salmon. I ate at my dining room table, using the good china. I poured myself a glass of the crisp Sauvignon Blanc I saved for special occasions. Reclaiming one's life, I decided, was a very special occasion. The phone rang at 7:15 p.m., right on schedule. I let it ring 3 times before I picked it up, taking a small, calming sip of wine. "Hello, Sarah, don't you hello, Sarah me," she shrieked, her voice a high-pitched nail on the chalkboard of my newfound peace. "What did you do? What is wrong with you?" Margaret just called me, gushing, thanking me for being so thoughtful and sending her my birthday cookies. "My cookies, Mom. How could you do something so bizarre, so hostile?" I took another sip of wine. My calmness was my shield and my sword. "They weren't your cookies, Sarah. As you pointed out, they were my birthday cookies. And I, as the recipient, decided to regift them. I thought it was a lovely gesture, a lovely gesture. It was humiliating. You made me look like an idiot. And you lied to her. What is this, some kind of passive-aggressive game?" "Passive?" I allowed a small, dry chuckle. "Oh, no, dear. I don't think this is passive at all. I think this is the most active and aggressive I've been in our relationship in 30 years. This is me, finally speaking in a language you seem to understand, the language of grand, empty gestures." There was a sputtering silence on the other end. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head, unable to compute this new version of her mother. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally stammered. "You're being crazy. You're just being overly sensitive because you didn't like the cookies, you're right." "I didn't like the cookies," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, level tone. "But let's be very clear. This has nothing to do with baked goods. This is about a lifetime of being treated like a utility. An ATM. A free babysitting service. A 24-hour emotional support hotline that you only call when you need something." "That is not true," she yelled. "After everything I do for you. Let's talk about that, shall we?" I said. And then I opened the floodgates. The meticulously kept files in my mind became my testimony. "Let's talk about the $50,000 for your wedding, Sarah. Or the $25,000 for the down payment on your house, which came from the last of your father's life insurance. Let's talk about the approximately $21,600 I saved you in childcare over the last 5 years by watching the children 3 days a week so you could climb the corporate ladder. Let's talk about the car you drove in college, the insurance I paid for, the spring break trips, the rent for your first apartment. Let's talk about the hundreds of hours I spent editing your papers, helping you move, cooking you meals. Let's quantify it, Sarah, since that seems to be the only value you recognize." A choked sound came from her end of the line. I could hear my grandson Leo in the background, a muffled, "Mom, just listen to her," she shushed him angrily. "This isn't about money," she hissed. "It's about family." "No," I corrected her firmly. "You don't get to use that word as a shield for your exploitation anymore. Family is a reciprocal arrangement, Sarah. It is a thing you nurture. It is a place of mutual respect. What we have is a business relationship, where I am the sole investor, and you are the perpetually defaulting beneficiary. But the bank is closed. The funds have been withdrawn. She was crying now, but they were the tears of a thwarted child, not the tears of remorse. You're being so cruel, she sobbed. You've ruined your own birthday just to punish me. No, Sarah, I said, my voice softening, not with pity, but with the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. You didn't give me a birthday. You gave me a task. An insult. A box of cheap cookies. I simply returned it to sender. From now on, I am no longer your service provider. I am just your mother. If you ever decide you want to build a real relationship based on that fact, you know where I live. But my services, financial, emotional, and domestic, are no longer available. Enjoy the cookies. I pressed the end call button on my phone's screen. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of peace. I then opened my contacts, found her name, and with a steady finger, I pressed block. The chain was broken. The days that followed the great cookie confrontation were the quietest I had ever known, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the serene silence of a library after closing, not the tense silence of a home waiting for a phone that never rings. The phantom weight of expectation, a burden I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying, was gone. I felt lighter. I woke up in the mornings and the first thought in my head wasn't, I wonder if Sarah will need me today. It was, what shall I do for myself today? The change was seismic. I had breakfast on my patio. I reread Pride and Prejudice for the 10th time. I took a drive to the coast and walked on the beach, letting the salty wind whip through my hair. I had spent so many years as the sturdy, unmoving anchor in my daughter's turbulent sea that I had forgotten I was a ship, perfectly capable of charting my own course. As predicted, Beatrice was my staunchest ally. We started a weekly tradition of going to a little French bistro for lunch. Over coq au vin and crisp glasses of Sancerre, we would talk for hours. She never once said, "But she's your daughter," she only ever said, "You deserve to be happy, Eleanor." Her friendship became my new foundation, one built on mutual respect and shared laughter, not on obligation and guilt. A week after the phone call, a card appeared in my mailbox. The handwriting was Sarah's. I opened it with a strange sense of detachment. Inside, it read, "I can't believe you would throw away our family over a box of cookies. I hope you're happy in your lonely, bitter life." There was no remorse, no introspection. Only blame. The words that once would have shattered me now seemed pathetic. I saw them for what they were, the last, desperate tantrum of an entitled child who had lost control of her favorite toy. I calmly walked to my kitchen, tore the card into 4 precise pieces, and dropped them into the recycling bin. The most surprising development, however, came from my grandson, Leo. He was 16, a quiet, observant boy I had always felt a connection with. He showed up at my door one Saturday afternoon, looking nervous. "Hi, Grandma," he said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Can I come in?" I led him to the kitchen, and he sat at the table where his mother had once cried for her dream wedding. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry," he began, his voice earnest. "I heard the whole phone call. The things you said, about the money for the house and watching us all the time. Mom never told us that. She always just said you liked helping. But what you said, it made sense. And she's been awful to Dad all week. Yelling that he doesn't appreciate her enough." It was, weirdly familiar. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a dawning, adult understanding. "You were right, Grandma. And I miss you." In that moment, I felt a crack in the icy resolve that had protected me. A single, warm tear traced a path down my cheek. This was not a transactional relationship. This was real. This was the reciprocity I had craved. "I miss you too, my dear boy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. The next week, I invited Leo over. "I am going to teach you a family secret," I told him. I pulled out my old recipe book, its pages softened and stained with the love of decades, and opened it to the instructions for a princess castle cake. We spent the entire afternoon in a cloud of flour and sugar, our hands dusty, our faces smeared with pink frosting. We built turrets from ice cream cones and a drawbridge from licorice whips. It wasn't as perfect as the one I had made for his mother 30 years ago, but it was infinitely more meaningful. We were not just baking a cake, we were rebuilding a legacy. We were creating a new tradition, one founded not on duty, but on a freely given, mutual love. As I watched Leo proudly take a picture of our magnificent, lopsided creation, I knew I had found my vindication. It wasn't in punishing Sarah, or in winning an argument. It was here, in this kitchen, with this boy. It was in the quiet joy of being seen, of being valued, of passing on the best parts of myself to someone who would truly cherish them. My life was not over. It had not been ruined. It had simply been edited, the toxic chapters removed to make space for a much more beautiful story. My world is smaller now, but it is also infinitely larger. My days are no longer structured around the potential needs of a daughter who saw me as a convenience, but around the simple, profound pleasures of a life lived on my own terms. My chosen family, my steadfast friend Beatrice, my thoughtful grandson Leo, the warm and welcoming women from my new book club, has filled the spaces that were once occupied by hollow duty. We are a family bound not by blood, but by choice, by shared stories, by the mutual agreement that kindness is a currency that should flow in all directions. I am still a mother, and I am still a grandmother. But I am no longer a provider of services. I am Eleanor Vance, a woman of 70 years, who finally learned that the most important person you have to take care of is yourself. I am tending my roses, and for the first time, they are not a backdrop for someone else's drama, they are simply for me, beautiful and thriving in the sun. The silence in my house is no longer an ache, it is a symphony of peace. I don't know if Sarah will ever truly understand the damage her neglect caused, or the reasons for my rebellion. Perhaps one day, when she is my age, she will look at her own children and finally comprehend the difference between giving out of love and giving out of obligation. Or perhaps she never will. It no longer matters. Her validation is not a thing I seek. I have found my worth not in her hollow praise or last-minute gifts, but in the quiet dignity of my own resilience. I built a castle of love for her when she was a child, and she let it crumble. So, I have learned to build a new life for myself, a fortress of self-respect, with foundations so deep they can never be shaken again. They say that blood is thicker than water, a phrase often used to demand loyalty and enforce familial obligation. But they forget the full saying, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means the bonds we choose, the families we forge for ourselves based on love and mutual respect, are stronger than the ones we are merely born into. Eleanor's story is a quiet rebellion against a lifetime of being taken for granted. It is a powerful reminder that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but the ultimate act of self-preservation. It teaches us that true family is not about who you share a history with, but who you can build a future with. What do you think? Was Eleanor justified in making such a drastic move, or is the bond between a mother and child something that should never be broken, no matter the cost? Share your thoughts below.